Welcome back to Hartfelt Beer Reviews. Again, my name is Kyle Hart. We got another review today. This is 50/50 Brewing Company's Eclipse Manhattan Cherry Rye. Now, I can only assume that this is their interpretation of the Manhattan cocktail in a beer form. There are a lot of brewing companies that are doing that as of the last year or two. Firestone Walker made one called Dark and Stormy, which is a rum cocktail. And then there were ones that do, old-fashioned cocktails. Central Waters just made one. There was an old-fashioned cocktail interpretation into a Imperial Stout. And this is 50/50 Brewing Companies out of Truckee, California. They do make several varieties every single year. Generally, they actually made, I think, around 12 varieties each year that were all brewed with honey and then aged in a different specific bourbon barrel or whiskey barrel. This is the 2019 vintage. So what they're doing different this year, instead of brewing with honey in all of their beer, they're actually aging every one of their beers in some type of barrel, whether it be brandy or bourbon or rye or what have you. They're aging it in some type of barrel, either laden with adjuncts or not. So this one in particular is, again, 2019's Eclipse Barrel Aged Imperial Stout, Manhattan Cherry Rye. This is Imperial Stout aged in cherry brandy, vermouth, and rye whiskey barrels. I've never once heard of a beer being aged in vermouth barrels, which obviously would make sense if they're looking to go for the Manhattan cocktail interpretation. 11.6 alcohol by volume, not too bad. I'm going to go ahead and read you the description here. This is Manhattan Cherry Rye. Now, this is the 12th vintage in our 2019 Eclipse. That is our rich Imperial Stout aged to perfection in whiskey and spirit barrels. All Eclipse start with the same base beer, bringing hints of dark chocolate, espresso, and smooth complexity, with each barrel treatment delivering its own unique character after a minimum of 180 days of aging. Manhattan Cherry Rye is aged in cherry brandy, vermouth, and rye whiskey barrels. This is definitely going to be unique, to say the least. Now, my biggest issue with this brewing company is the last few years I've had, different variants and vintages dating back to probably 2016. They're very, very hard to get a hold of. As far as I know, again, I could be wrong, they're really only available in a few states, like California, where they're brewed. I've seen them in Buffalo, New York. I've seen them in Chicago. I actually ordered this one on craftshack.com. You can find them online, and they have thousands of beers that will ship to your front door for a fee from California. And I believe I've had someone tell me that they're available in Arizona as well, which I have not been there, so I couldn't tell you firsthand. But to say the least, as I said, this is going to be a unique brew. But back to the topic I was saying, these are very hit or miss for me. Either they're really, really good, or they're just awful. I try to be as objective as possible. I don't want to put in my opinion, because just because I don't like something doesn't necessarily make it a good or bad beer. I just want to give you the best review possible that I think everyone can really understand. I'm going to go ahead and crack this open. This has got the wax seal on here, which can sometimes be a pain, but I have loosened it up, cut through the wax before I started the review just to make it a little bit easier. And I've let it sit out for about 12 minutes to kind of get as close to room temperature as possible. I don't want it to be exactly room temperature, still want it to be cold, but I repeat this in all of my reviews, but I think it's essential knowledge that everyone needs to understand if they don't already, or if they happen to be a new a viewer to our channel. All stout beer, really, unless you're drinking an IPA or a lager, any beer that's dark has the potential, depending on how it's been brewed or what adjuncts have been added into the beer, or if it's been aged in any kind of barrel or spirit barrel, what have you. You cannot taste the potential that the beer has to offer if it's too cold. Your palate just can't adjust, it can't acclimate properly. So you want to make sure it's not too cold. Again, warm beer doesn't sound too appetizing either, so you want to make sure no more than 12 minutes or so. Should be fine. Out of the bottle, I'm getting cherry sweetness and rye whiskey and oak, which is just fantastic. I happen to love Manhattans myself, but we'll see how this interpretation goes into beer form. I do worry that it's going to be quite thin, but like I said, that doesn't necessarily make the beer a bad beer. Just in my opinion, you know, a thin mouthfeel, especially in a stout, can really negatively impact the style of beer. I'm going to go ahead and give you a pour, tell you what I think about the appearance, the aroma, and then the final taste for you. Cheers. Don't want to go too hard of a pour, you know, I want to try to get ahead on here so I can give you a review, but too much, then it just be bad form. Okay, so it does look quite thin. Less than a finger head worth of foam here. Not too compact bubbles. The bubbles are spread out fairly awkwardly, but again, I don't really care about that too much. It's not as dark as you would expect. I mean, there's obviously no light retention through it, so it is opaque, but I have seen them darker. So the aroma, cherry for days, and it's almost a fresh cherry. I shouldn't say almost. It is a fresh cherry. It doesn't taste like cherry syrup or anything like that. It really tastes like you're opening a jar of cherries that have the syrup in there already, but I'm not getting that artificial syrup kind of aroma off this. I'm getting the spicy rye, vanilla, getting a moderate amount of oak. It's not too forward. I'm not picking up anything on the vermouth. Granted, vermouth is really just used as a mixer to impart dryness or to balance out a potential sweetness of a cocktail. I'm not getting any kind of chocolate. Obviously, there's no coffee with this. Other than aged in cherry brandy barrels, there's no adjuncts added to this. You know, there's no coffee, there's no caramel, there's no vanilla added to the barrel. But there are sometimes you can pick up, you know, caramels, vanillas, oaks, maples, things like that from the barrels that they're being aged in. But since this has been aged in cherry brandy, vermouth, and rye whiskey barrels, I'm hoping that the vermouth really is just to cut back some of the potential sweetness that could be derived from this beer. And then the rye is just going to give it a balance of oak, vanilla, some caramels, things like that that are really standard for the style. But let's go ahead and dive right in. I can't wait any longer. Cheers. Whoa. Absolutely wild. I've never tasted anything like this in my life. You're getting a big, juicy cherry. Not tart and not too sweet. Also, another thing I was worried about is often when cherries are brewed with beer, if they use too much, you can impart kind of a metallic off flavor, which I really don't care for. I'm not getting that at all. Again, this has not been brewed with cherries that I'm aware of. This has been aged in cherry brandy barrels. The vermouth, really, there's just a lingering dryness in the finish, which I think is just to impart some of that to balance off the sweetness from the cherry brandy that I can only assume. And the rye is just there enough to kind of tease you. You know, it's not too forward. It's not so subtle that it's not there. You know, I am getting soft vanilla, very light chocolate. I'm getting that spicy, lingering rye. I did a review yesterday that was an Imperial Stout aged in rye barrels that had kind of an astringency to it because it was so rye dominant. I'm not getting that in this beer. It's actually quite pleasing. It's just sweet enough that you're imparting that cherry brandy note. And for those of you who don't know, the difference between like a brandy and a regular, you know, bourbon whiskey is one, bourbon has to be made with 51% corn. Bourbon has to be made with 51% corn. and it has to be aged in a newly charred American white oak barrel for no less than 2 years. It can't have any additives to it. Where brandy or cognac actually are spirits aged, or I should say, made with fruit instead of grain. So instead of using corn or rye that a rye or a bourbon would use, brandy uses usually grapes or any other type of fruit. In particular, this one is cherries. But cognac is really the same thing as brandy. It's just made in Cognac, France, so it's specific. The water there, they say, is have a higher quality, and, it's France, so they have a higher quality standard for almost everything. But we'll go ahead and dive right back in. I want to try to let this sit out before I do the review. Obviously, that I've mentioned for it to warm up so I can impart more flavor, but I want to see if this beer changes, because oftentimes, if you drink these too cold or I wouldn't even say too cold, if you drink them now and wait 10 or 15 minutes, they really open up to a far more complexity depth that you just are almost drinking an entirely different beer. This beer might be that way, it might not, but let's go for another taste here. Okay, I'm getting a big cherry now. Far more than the first time. That rye whiskey barrel is really coming through. Just enough to balance out that sweetness as well as the vermouth. So that rye whiskey's coming in, that rye spice. I wouldn't say aggressiveness because it's not too forward. Just enough of a pop of that rye grain to give you the caramels, the vanillas. I even get a nice butterscotch. The roasted malts are nicely balanced from this beer. It's not too roast forward, and it's not so under roasted that it's thin. A lot of these beers tend to be thin. This is not too thin. It's just on the cusp of being thin and being viscous, in my opinion. There are some Imperial Stouts that are like oil, and there are some that are just water, which I really can't stand. But back to the description of this beer. You're getting big cherry lingering, fruit freshness. So you're not getting that syrupy, fake, artificial kind of note that you get sometimes in flavored beer. Since this is not flavored, this is just aged in cherry brandy barrels. Then you're getting that vanilla, the big caramels. You're getting, a depth of roasted malts. It's not too forward. I'm not picking up any chocolate note or any kind of butterscotch note or maple note that you would sometimes get from rye whiskey. You just really, that I enjoy, like if I drink a bourbon, I enjoy that I can pick up the fresh corn sweetness from the grain itself. That they're not being added, syrups aren't being added to this, or other flavorings aren't being added to this. All that extra pop of that grain is coming from the whiskey barrel. So you're getting a moderate amount of oak, some soft vanilla, the upfront spicy rye grain that's having a fresh of cherry pop just right up front at the tip of the tongue. And then that vermouth is just there, I believe, to just balance all that out. And it's just a nice lingering dryness in the finish, which is not too bad. Let's go for the final taste here. Cheers. So the aroma, I'm really getting cherry, like a fresh maraschino cherry. No tartness. This is not tart. This is not sour whatsoever. Vanilla. Big oak. No astringency, which I enjoy. I'm glad that it doesn't have that. This is quite nice. The alcohol is hidden. You can tell it's a little bit high. It's above 8% alcohol for sure. But this does not have a booziness to it. This does not have a heat to it from the alcohol. There are some even that are 10 or 11% that you can really tell that it's a high octane beer. I had one last night that was like 14% alcohol that you could really tell that was that high. Granted, when you get above 12%, it's expected. You know, you're going to be able to taste that alcohol. But for 11.6% alcohol, this is really not that bad. And I'm not even a few drinks in, I'm not really feeling like I've had a drink. There are some that really hit hard, and when they hit you good. I'm not getting that with this, which is great because this makes it upteenthly drinkable. You know, you could sip on this for 30 minutes, 25 minutes, maybe even an hour, depending on how much you want to draw this out. See how much flavor opens up. I actually prefer to do that myself, just so I can get an overall review of the beer. And then if I want to buy this beer again, I can just drink it however I want to. I've got an understanding as I'm training to become a grade 2 or 3 level Cicerone. I'm trying to really get an objective point of view. I'm not trying to become opinionated. I don't want people to think that, oh, you know, he only reviews beers that he likes or he doesn't like anything. I want to give an honest brew review that I can for you viewers or anyone really tuning in. This is a passion of mine. I have been lacking the last few months due to some issues that I've had to deal with personally, but hopefully in the coming days to weeks, I will be sending out a mass amount of beer reviews because I've got a whole fridge full of wonderful craft beer all across the country, some even from Europe. A lot of them are really rare that they're going to be quite hard to find, but hopefully you will enjoy that influx of beer reviews that will be coming out shortly. Now, like I said, this 50/50 Brewing Company out of Treka, California, quite hard to find, I think, unless you're lucky enough to live in either Chicago, Buffalo, New York, Arizona, or somewhere in California where this is brewed. Then you're probably going to have to find this online. Again, I found mine on craftshack.com. Craft Beer Kings is another website that offers these beers and several other beers, not just these. But this has been my review of Eclipse Brewing Company's Manhattan Cherry Rye. Thanks again for tuning in, and I hope you have a good rest of your day. Cheers.